Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 131, Competition Modules for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, so I told you last week that this week's show would be a surprise to both of us, and I said that because I was working research on several of the old school series of modules for AD&D, D&D, and I wasn't sure which series was going to be finished first. Plus, I'm working on research for the holiday episode and the year-end news show that we're going to do. So it basically boiled down to which module line I could get done the fastest, which brings us to today's topic, which are competition modules for AD&D. So, rather than me just continuing to blither on like an idiot, let's say we crank up the tour bus and get this show on the road. But before we actually get into the competition modules, I think we need to discuss the subject of D&D competitions. For our younger audience, the concept of competitive D&D is a lot like competitive sleeping or competitive football watching, and in this instance, we'll use both definitions of football. So, how can playing D&D be a competitive thing? This is where us old schoolers get another opportunity to tell one of those back in my day stories. Competition D&D began in the late 1970s, and TSR had an official competition at Gen Con called the D&D Open Championship. Now that still exists to this day, though it's now known as the D&D Championship Series. Beyond that, numerous conventions over the years have hosted their own competitions, and regardless of the convention and its specific rules, there's a basic formula most of them use. Competitors typically are sorted into teams, and those are teams sizes anywhere from 6 to 10. For there, it works like this. All players taking part are given pre-generated characters, and those are the same for each table. Also, the adventure being run is the same for each table. There's a time frame for the session, typically between 3 and 4 hours, then the scores are tallied. Now, scoring is typically done by somebody not involved in the game in any way, but if it's not, it's done by the DM. And a lot of tournaments don't get too specific about how the scoring works, but the prevailing thought is that how the characters are played, how the team works together, and how they solve each situation they're in are definitely a part of it. So, when the round is done and scored, a certain number of teams or a certain number of individuals will move on to the next round. Think of it like this. You've got 60 folks in round 1, you cut to 30 or even 20 if you're looking to end things early, then to 15 or 10 if you're following the last example. Many competitions change out the adventure from round to round so that players can't work off of knowledge picked up in the previous round. Of course, new pre-generated characters would be presented if that's the case. However, as we'll see in the modules that we're covering today, they're actually built to run for an entire competition. So those are the basics. We'll dig deeper into tournaments in another show, but I needed to give you that because I wanted you to have a basic understanding of what competitive D&D is before I broke down the modules. So with the explanation out of the way, let's get into the competition series of modules. For all the explanation I just gave, there are only 6 modules in the line, but 2 of them are considered to be among the best modules of all time. And the reason why there are only 6 modules in the line is that even though there was a new competition module every year, not all of them were worked up for wide release. The first module in the line, C1, the Hidden Shrine of Tamochin, was used as the module for the AD&D tournament at Origins in 1979. Written by Harold Johnson and Jeff Leeson and designed for the first edition of AD&D, the tournament version of the adventure checked in at 40 pages, loose leaf, and presented in a zipper storage bag. This was contained inside a light blue cover when presented to players. Additional inclusions were a scoring system for the session and the pre-rolled characters for the players to use. Only 300 copies of this were printed for use at Origins that year, and there were a few copies left afterwards. Those were offered for sale at the Dungeon Shop in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and they are considered to be exceptionally rare collector's items, so if you happen to have one, you are sitting on a gold mine. One other thing to check on is the title. The competition version didn't have a module code on it, and the title was different, as it was titled Lost Tamochin, the Hidden Shrine of Lubatum. The version of the module that we know and love was released in 1980, and it came as a 32-page book and an 8-page book with an outer folder and a 2-color cover. Errol Otis handled the art for the cover, and he split the illustrations with Darlene Pecule. This version was the first to have the C1 code on it, and this version sold so well that another printing was done in 1981. But there are differences that will dictate which one you've got. The 1980 version has a monochrome cover depicting a fire-breathing bat monster, while the 1981 printing has a dark brown full cover with a green giant on it. And by the way, am I the only one who just heard, ho, ho, ho? Never mind, if you get it, you get it. Let's just move on. The 1981 printing also had a separate book of artwork in it with illustrations from the various encounters in the game. Errol Otis, Jeff D., Greg Fleming, David S. LaForce, and David C. Sutherland III are the credited artists for those. After the 1981 printing, Hidden Shrine, I'm shortening the name to make this easier, didn't see another edition and was basically allowed to go out of print. But Wizards of the Coast, as tends to be their style from time to time, recognized a quality adventure when they saw it, and they adapted some of that for the 2006 series Savage Tide Adventure Path. Now, they didn't use the entire adventure, but the dungeon from the original was used pretty much as is, with obvious 3rd edition adjustments made. If you're looking for this version, the title of the adventure is The Sea Wyvern's Wake, or Sea Wyvern's Wake, depending on how you pronounce that, and it's in the December 2006 edition of Dungeon Magazine. And for those who've got a copy of the 2017 5th edition compilation book, Tales from the Yawning Portal, Hidden Shrine reappears in all of its glory in that book, updated for 5th edition, because of course it is. One more trivia piece here. Hidden Shrine was the first module to use the boxed read-aloud text that so many of us appreciated at the time, but cringe at when we read it today. I mean, I love a good module, but some of that wording, Getting into the actual adventure, Hidden Shrine was the first that introduced AD&D players to the Ullman culture that existed in the world of Greyhawk, which, as you'll remember, was Gary Gygax's setting. That society was based loosely on Aztec, Mayan, and other Central and South American cultures. And it does something rather unusual for an AD&D adventure. It specifically references deities from an actual culture or religion, such as the Aztec gods, rather frequently. Hidden Shrine is based in the Amadillo jungle, a temple that's fallen into ruin, and both are near the ruined city of Temoachin. The beauty of the adventure is that it's very much focused on defeating traps and solving puzzles instead of necessarily defeating enemies. Again, that calls back to the original purpose of the module being created for competition purposes. And as it was created for competition, it's a standalone adventure, so once the group gets through all of the traps and reaches the final destination, the story is complete. Overall, the critics really seem to like this adventure, and as I noted in the episode about the greatest D&D adventures of all time, Hidden Shrine came in at 18. And while I could choose any of a dozen different reviews, I chose one that's a little less glowing and a bit more of what I call the middle ground. Doug Traversa handled the review for the 1980 issue of The Space Gamer. He said, quote, "This module is well thought out and is very detailed. The illustrations are accurate and add an extra dimension to the adventure. Reference sheets contain a combat matrix for the 3 characters included and a monster index with the statistics of all of the creatures in the shrine," end quote. However, he had a couple of issues. Quote, "The shrine has 2 entrances, but the rules are written based on the assumption that you enter through the tournament entrance. If you choose to use the other, more obvious entrance, the DM must read the rules from back to front, which can get confusing. Although the map and rules are detailed, they are also confusing, and parts of the scoring system seem less than logical," end quote. He finished by stating, quote, "Of all the modules TSR has published, and I have read them all, I would rate this right in the middle. For those DMs who have trouble designing their own dungeons, I say buy it. For those who don't, save your money and make your own shrine," end quote. The next release in the line is C2, The Ghost Tower of Inverness, or Inverness. Again, pronounce it however you do. Written by Alan Hammock with art from Jim Roslov and Errol Otis, the module was originally designed for use at WinterCon 7 in November of 1979. As with the last entry in the show, it had an original run of 300 that were numbered and printed as 40 loose leaf pages in a Ziploc bag. There was also a printed copy that was sold at the convention itself, but this version was never widely distributed. You'll know if you've got one of these because it doesn't have the C2 designation on it, and it has a green monochrome cover. It's also got illustrations from Errol Otis that weren't used in the version that was ultimately published. And as you'd expect, this version of the module is one of those that fans and collectors alike are always searching for, so it'll fetch a pretty penny if you happen to have it. The module saw its official release in 1980. This version has a red cover with art from Jim Roslov. The illustrators for this version were Jeff D., Greg Fleming, David LaForce, David C. Sutherland III, and Errol Otis. C2 came, as most modules did at the time, as a 32-page booklet with an outer folder. Ghost Tower also saw itself transformed into an AD&D adventure game book in 1985. Think of that line as a combination of tabletop game and choose-your-own adventure. For the record, that line only ran from 1985 to 1988. Ghost Tower has been out of print since the mid-1980s, so you know the drill if you're looking for a copy. However, its spirit has been kept alive in a number of other releases over the decades. In 2003, the RPGA Living Greyhawk campaign released the title Return to the Ghost Tower of Inverness. Creighton Broadhurst and Steve Pierce handled the writing, and this title advanced the story several years and worked from the premise of what might still be in the tower after the original adventure had been completed. It was a 3rd edition adventure, so the various adjustments you expect were present, and a few of the particulars of the setting had to be adjusted to fit into the changes in Greyhawk that had been made over the years. In the 2005 movie Dungeons & Dragons: Wrath of the Dragon God, the Ghost Tower got a mention as the movie's hero made reference to having gotten help from a cleric while at the tower. And if you don't remember that movie, you are not the only one. It was a straight-to-DVD release, and I'll cover it when I do next week's show, since I'll get into the various television shows and movies based on tabletop role-playing games. Ghost Tower has also seen itself become a setting mod for the online game Neverwinter Nights, where it's been well received and quite successful. However, when it became a super endless quest book, it tanked. You can't win them all, I guess. So what's the Ghost Tower all about? The basics are that the PCs are on the hunt for the Soul Gem, which is a legendary artifact of great power. The bulk of the adventure involves the group searching for and gathering the 4 parts of the key that will allow them to get into the Ghost Tower. Now, there's a lot of backstory to this, but I'll leave that for you to check out for yourselves. What I will say is that each level of the tower is built to be a potential TPK for the group. The Soul Gem itself could be a TPK, as it wants to take the souls of the PC as they try to take it, which is what made the Ghost Tower a perfect adventure for a competition. Let's talk about the tournament version of the game, since there's a difference between it and the retail version, as you might expect. Players had 5 pre-generated characters to choose from, and the adventure starts with all of them being held in the dungeon of the Duke of the area for various crimes. It's the Duke who tasks them with retrieving the Soul Gem. The characters are Hodar, a sorcerer who uses magic that's banned by the Duke, and that's Hodar, not Hodor, just so we're clear. Zenithar, a priest who led a revolt against the Duke. Lembu, a fighter who killed a bunch of the Duke's men in a barroom brawl. Disinke, or Disink, depending on how you'd pronounce it, a thief. The crime? Tried to steal jewels from the crown, only to fall off a wall during their escape and land on the guard patrol. Li Han, a monk who's an indentured servant of the Duke. A bit stereotypical for the modern gamer, I know, but it's what we've got. The group gets gold from the Duke to equip themselves, plus a little something magical in the Amulet of Recall, which allows the group to be transported back to the Duke, regardless of where they are. The group is then transported to the site of the Ghost Tower and left to their own devices to get what they need. Needless to say, how they go about that is where points are given in tournament mode. When the group gets the parts of the key and goes to use it, they're transported back in time, though they are in the tower and also unaware that they've gone back in time. They work their way through the various encounters built into it until they reach the final level, which is where the Soul Gem is kept. It has its own protections in a force field that they have to get through, plus avoiding having their souls sucked out. When it's all said and done, the Duke will allow them to keep any treasure they found along the way, minus a 20% tax for himself. And if anyone was killed by the gem, the Duke's seer can and will bring them back to life. Now, checking out the published version, the story's the same. The differences come in the fact that the group does not get gold from the Duke to buy stuff, but this is counterbalanced by them not being charged the 20% tax at the end. Also, damage rolls are normal in this version, while in the tournament version, the amount of damage was set for each encounter. And of course, there are encounters and traps in the published version that didn't appear in the tournament version, since if you're playing at home, you're not subject to a 4-hour time limit to complete the module. When we talk about reviews, it needs to be noted that the Ghost Tower of Inverness was ranked in the 30th spot in the list of the greatest D&D adventures of all time in 2004. We'll hit up our frequent source for reviews in Jim Bambra, who did the honors for the April 1983 issue of White Dwarf. Overall, it got an 8 out of 10. He called it, quote, a thought-provoking adventure, end quote, and noted that the finale, quote, will have the players sweating in their seats as they struggle to overcome the final obstacle between them and their goal, end quote. He noted the emphasis on problem solving rather than hack and slash, and he stated, quote, encounters in the tower are interesting and increase in intensity the nearer players get to their goal, end quote. He also added that while the adventure was built for characters levels 5 through 7, they might need to go a bit higher if the group didn't have at least 8 players in it. Cruising along on this week's tour, we're up to the third module in the line, and it's The Lost Island of Castanamere. Written by Ken Rolston with artwork by Jeff Easley, it was originally a tournament module played at multiple convention tournaments in 1983 before getting its retail release in 1984. I was unable to get any info on the tournament version, but I'd bet good money it was around 40 pages, most likely loose leaf, and probably in a Ziploc bag. I'd also lay even money that no more than about 300 were available at any given convention. Just a guess. Insofar as the retail release, the cover art from Jeff Easley was on the outer folder, and while it's not one of his most iconic covers, it's still a damn good one. The module contained within that folder was 32 pages long. Oh, one thing I've forgotten to mention is that most of these adventures were designed specifically for groups of 5 to 8 players, so if your standard group was less than that, it would require some adjustments from the DM, as Jim Bambra noted in the review we covered for Ghost Tower. I also haven't been consistent with giving the character levels, but I'll note that for Lost Island, it's intended for characters level 1 to 4. The adventure itself goes like this. The group's approached by a mage and tasked with heading into the Sea of Pastures to check out this mysterious island due to an unusually large number of shipwrecks and missing people that have recently taken place. Think Bermuda Triangle with an island. After adventuring their way across said island, they find a stone door that leads to an underground complex. From there, they find 18 rooms linked by secret passages and magical portals, and while the majority of those rooms have been looted by previous survivors of the island, both human and monster by the way, there are some items and loot available for the group. For the record, those survivors are still in the complex, so the group will have to deal with them along the way, and while some of those interactions might be positive, the opposite is also very true and probably the most likely. The overall goal is to figure out what happened on the island, deal with the extraplanar creatures that exist in the complex, then make their way out and wait to be rescued. When I was looking for reviews online, I found a number of fan sites that noted that while the adventure was fun to play in a tournament, it seemed to lose a little something when it was played as a home adventure. Chris Hunter handled the review for the June 1985 issue of Imagine magazine, and he noted that in competition, quote, it's so tough that not everyone survives, end quote. That led him to suggest that when playing it at home, the DM have the characters be of a higher level than the recommended ones. He called it, quote, disjointed and difficult to DM, end quote, and he blamed that on the encounters, which in his opinion hadn't been fully fleshed out when it was written. The remainder of his review reads pretty much the same, and while he recommended it for those looking for a competition module, he'd suggest that players wanting to drop this into their campaign look somewhere else. The Lost Island of Castanamere has been out of print for nearly 40 years at this point, so our longtime listeners know the drill if you're looking for a copy. And I probably need to explain what the drill is, since we've picked up a lot of new listeners over the past couple of months who might not know what I'm referring to. If you're looking for out-of-print AD&D or D&D modules, I'd recommend a used game or bookshop, the DM's Guild, or drivethrurpg.com. Those would be good starting points. I also know that there are a number of vendors at conventions who deal in used games, so if you've got a convention near you, maybe check them out as well. And on the subject of DriveThruRPG, our friends at RPG Imaginings, Michael specifically, reminded me that if a license has been lost or given up by a company, their stuff won't be on DriveThruRPG. Now, I've listed some stuff over the last couple of years in episodes that are out of print, but the license has also been given up. So while I've pointed you in the direction of drivethrurpg.com, that turned out to not be the case. I apologize for that, and I will work to do better in the future. But that's really not going to come into play today because Wizards of the Coast owns the license on all of this. So if it's not on DM's Guild, it should be on DriveThruRPG because they do list some of the older stuff on there. Okay, and thanks again to Michael for sending me that DM so that I could fix that for you. Let's get back into the C series of modules with C4, To Find a King. Written by Bob Blake with cover art from Keith Parkinson and interiors from Ron Randall. It was originally designed to be the competition module at Gen Con 16 in 1983. The commercial version was released in 1985 and checked in at 32 pages with 2 outer folders. Something that makes To Find a King different from the previous 3 modules on this list is that while those weren't intended to be linked together, To Find a King specifically links to the next module on our list, the Bane of Llewellyn. In fact, they were the 2 competition modules at Gen Con 16. And for those who were looking to run it at home, you needed characters level 4 through 7, and you needed 10 of them to run it. So if your group was smaller, you'd have to adjust the character levels to make it work. The story here is that the characters have been assembled to help get the Celtic kingdom of Pelham back to its former glory, and they'll be working through wilderness in this first part, with a mirror maze and a bugbear lair being 2 of the major encounters they'll face. Ultimately, the group is working to find all of the keys to the Tomb of the Ancient Kings, and that's where they're going to wind up eventually. In this case, eventually means the next module. Jez Keane handled the review in the July 1985 issue of Imagine magazine. The overall review was positive, but Keane noted that, quote, play becomes unnecessarily bogged down in combat, end quote. But since it was intended for tournament play, Keane noted that the entire concept of a tournament was to, quote, separate the good players from the rest, end quote. Keane also pointed out the thinking necessary to complete the scenario, stating that, quote, there is a right way and a wrong way to do everything in this module, end quote. Ultimately, Keane called the scenarios within the module, quote, a pleasure to play and run, end quote. Tell you what, since we've already referenced the next adventure in this list, let's jump into it. C5, The Bane of Llewellyn, was written by Bob Blake with Keith Parkinson handling the cover and Ron Randall taking on the interior art. Weighing in at 32 pages with 2 outer folders, the commercial release was in 1985. I already addressed its purpose for tournament play, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. Doesn't mean I didn't repeat myself earlier in the episode or that I won't do it again before we're done, but it's a personality thing. I'm working on it, or at least that's what my therapist tells me. Picking up where To Find a King left off, the group gathers the final keys they need, and they've gathered the symbols that are also required. That means their mission is to find the burial location of the king, who's been dead for a long time, use the magics they've acquired to raise him, and finally restore Pelham back to its glory. It's a test of skill and will, since gathering the items will have come at a significant cost, but those who've done it right will be very well rewarded. As was the case with To Find a King, Bane of Llewellyn was intended for 10 players with character levels 4 through 7. The review for this one comes from Mark Davies in the September 1985 issue of Imagine magazine. He liked the module overall and noted that you could run it separate from To Find a King, though you would need to make a couple of tweaks. He said it was, quote, above average in conception with a lot of good ideas, end quote. However, he did note, as we've noted more than once during this show, that the expected group size was a bit large, so he suggested 4 to 7 players at levels 6 through 8. And he knocked competition D&D in the US as it, quote, depends more on high IQ than on role-playing, end quote. That comment, by the way, was directed at the puzzles and riddles contained in the module. Getting back to the review, Davies criticized the maps either because they weren't of very high quality or due to the fact that the final scenario didn't have one. Needless to say, both C4 and C5 have been out of print for nearly 40 years, so again, you know the drill. Last up in the series is a release that some consider to be a part of the C series and others see as being separate from it. Since it does carry the C6 code on it, I'm treating it as a part of the line, so we're going to cover it on today's show. The official RPGA Tournament Handbook is the title, and it's pretty much what it says it is. Written by Daniel Kramarski and Gene and Bruce Rabe, this release checked in at 54 pages with an outer folder when it was released in 1987. So for those of you who aren't old enough to remember, RPGA stands for the Role Players Guild of America. It was a group essentially founded by TSR, with paying members receiving a number of benefits and early access. I'm not going to get into more detail on this since the RPGA is going to be the subject of a future show. I just wanted to have a bit of context for you so you understand what's coming next. The purpose of this release was to teach potential RPGA game masters how to run a tournament. It contained the rules for running adventures for RPGA-sanctioned tournaments, as well as to actually create a tournament of your own, along with advice on how to judge a tournament, in case you got the opportunity to do so. But it's not all about rules and advice. There are 2 tournament-ready scenarios included, and they're designed for 10 players, character level 4 through 8. And it includes 6 pre-generated characters for each scenario, so you do have options. The first scenario is Honor Guard. This scenario sees the PCs escorting an important religious figure, along with his relics, from one town to another. The big bad evil guy for this is a wizard who's trailing the party and intends to steal the relics. The second scenario is The Long Way Home. This scenario finds the characters wandering the desert of ages. They stop in a small deserted town where they encounter the spirit of a dwarf by the name of Otis. He offers them water if they can find the hammer rock splitter, drive out the dwerger in the area, and free his people. I was going to put a review in here, but the only one I found in its entirety came from Ken Rolston in Dragon Magazine, and I tend to not use Dragon reviews for D&D products if I can help it. However, when I was researching online, a number of old schoolers noted that some of the design notes were what helped them learn how to build an adventure, and many of them loved the scenarios contained within the pages of the release. So, overall, I'd say it's worth it if you can find it. And it goes without saying, but it's also been out of print for about 35 years, so again, you know the drill. I know I said it at the top of the show, but I wanted to make sure I repeated it. We will get deeper into Tournament D&D in another episode, and this is where I reach out to you to get suggestions on tournaments and scenarios you've played. I mean, hell, if you played any role-playing game in a tournament style, hit me up and let me know how it went. Either way, I'll make sure you get a shout-out in that future episode. So with all that, I think this is a good stopping point for today's tour. Next week, we're going to cover role-playing games in television and movies. D&D is going to get a lot of, if not most of, the attention thanks to the cartoon series and the movies, but there are some other games that have gotten some love over the years as well, and I'm going to do my best to not leave those out. In the meantime, check out Bad GM's campaign Build Along. This week we get our group another assignment as their faction of the Brotherhood of Steel looks to stop the threat from the competing group. Needless to say, we're making our way towards the end game, as Dr. Strange would say, so you're not going to want to miss out. Bad GM's campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We've got a presence all over social media, so check the info box for this episode or the website badgmproductions.net to see where you can follow us. Next week, we're going to the movies, baby. Well, the movies and television either based on role-playing games or where they have a significant presence. You get the picture. See what I did there? That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis and your Role-Playing History.